in Deep Geek Live. This is a live stream, which is just a solo live stream, but it's going to be focusing in on A Song of Ice and Fire, the books, a little bit about the show as well, but I think we're largely moving on from that now to focus in on what's happening next in the books. This is an open Q&A, so please do drop your questions down there in the chat as we go along. As always, I'm structuring my live stream around questions that I get from my patrons over on Patreon. I've got some fantastic questions coming up, which are quite wide ranging. So we're going to be moving around quite a bit on this one. But I try and do these solo live streams largely because I want to be able to answer as many questions as I possibly can. So that means going through my patrons' questions and the questions that come up in the chat as we're going along. This is, if you're watching live, this is 1 hour earlier than usual. So thank you so much for tuning in for this one. If you're not watching live, makes no difference to you whatsoever, I'm sure, but this is probably going to be my new live stream time going forward. It's a little bit earlier for me here in the UK at 10 o'clock my time rather than starting at 11 o'clock. So anyway, welcome, great to see you all. Before we get into the questions, one small bit of admin or perhaps celebration of success. Literally 5 minutes before we went on air, this channel hit 25 million views, which I am absolutely blown away by. So I just wanted to say thank you. It means a huge amount to me, and it's all of these little milestones are just so encouraging as I go along. So yeah, it means a lot. I'm going to raise a glass of Dornish Red once we've finished, just to toast to that small victory. But thank you so much. However you've supported the growth of this channel over the months and years past, I really, really appreciate it. Okay, let's get into my first question from. This is from the Red Woman over on Patreon, saying, I know there are some allusions to the Long Night also happening in Essos in the World of Ice and Fire book, but are seasons in Essos as messed up as the seasons in Westeros? Obviously, the northern parts of Westeros are further north than northern parts of Essos, but winter affects pretty much all of Westeros, except perhaps Dorne, and the northern parts of Essos are parallel to regions like the Vale. So how come people in Essos don't seem concerned about the impending arrival of a mini ice age every few years? You'd think you'd meet someone in Essos who would have mentioned it. Donald Peoples, by the way, thank you so much for that super sticker. I saw that one just passing through just now. I really appreciate it. In answer to this, in terms of the seasons, so the entire planet's seasons are, from our perspective, out of kilter. That's it's not just Westeros that's a little bit affected by this, it's the entire planet. So the sort of the two broad differences from us are the fact that the winters and each season is longer than they are for us, and also they're a lot more variable. They don't know when the new winter or the new summer is going to come. So those are the big differences, and those are the same in Essos as they are in Westeros. So in answer to your question about why you don't meet people in Essos who are sort of like concerned about this, you do on one level, but also it's the same as in our world. It's just that's how it always has been. So you would talk about the climate and the weather and everything else in the same way that we would hear talking about winter's coming or something along those lines. It's not a weird thing for them. This is just natural and normal. This is how it always has been, as far as they're concerned. This is how it always will be. So that's where it is. In terms of the sort of the geography, yes, you're right. So Braavos at the sort of the northwestern end of Essos, that's roughly on a par with the Vale. So everything we see sort of down south from there, Pentos all the way down to sort of Volantis and things like that, that is going way down south, heading towards sort of the same latitude as sort of Dawn and places like that. So you don't see it as much as you do over in Westeros, because it's sort of slightly shifted down south. The north for them is the equivalent of like the Vale, so it's heading towards sort of the northern Riverlands. So that's the kind of situation you've got going on there. And I think that my short answer is it's just normal to them. That's how it feels, if it always has been. So people aren't surprised by these things. It's just how things are going. Stephen Stark, thank you so much. That's a very generous super chat, saying, for the 25 million views, congrats to one of the greatest content creators. Oh, you're going to make me blush on YouTube. You are a rock star, Robert. Thank you, Stephen. You are the real rock star, and I think we all know that. But that's very kind. Thank you. So we had connected to that. Well, actually, Dan Windsor, thank you again for the super chat, saying, hey, Robert, that's very generous. Thank you. Hey, Robert, keep up the good work. Any updates on the Winds of Winter or the prequels? Well, I can give you what I know about what's going on with the prequels, which is roughly the same as the last couple of live streams I did. So we've got one prequel, which is George R. R. Martin keeps on referring it to as the prequel I'm not supposed to call The Long Night, which is the one which is being helmed by Jane Goldman. This is the one that we're often told about, the title Blood Moon, that one. So that has filmed a pilot. It is currently in post-production. So they're adding in all the graphics and doing all the cleaning and editing and all the rest of it that they need to do to it. And after that, at some point, presumably at some point reasonably soon, that's going to go to the executives and HBO, and they will make a decision on whether to commission off of the back of that. Now, George R. R. Martin is very supportive of that. He said, well, he was over in Europe, he met up with Jane Goldman, and he's very excited by the project. So I think the working assumption is that one probably will be greenlit, but we'll just have to wait and see. We've also been told, and there is, if you go onto George R. R. Martin's Not a Blog website, you will see quite a long post about this. There is a second prequel that is nearing a pilot commission. So what that means is that it's being developed and that HBO are almost at the point where they're about to say, go away, do a pilot, and then we'll make a decision on it. Now, that is seemingly based about 300 years before the events of A Song of Ice and Fire, placing it roughly around the early part of Fire and Blood, the book that we had, Fire and Blood Part 1, and probably in one of two time zones, either Aegon's conquest or a little bit later, if they're being slightly more free and loose with the timescales, a little bit later with the Dance of the Dragons. Now, I would be happy with either. Both would make fantastic stories. I think, if anything, that is a slightly more bankable success than something obscure set 5,000 years in the past without any of the places that we really know and any of the houses that we really know. If you had something based with the Targaryens and with dragons and the founding of King's Landing and Starks and Baratheons, people would feel a little bit more home. So out of the two, I think that one probably is slightly more likely, but if they go ahead with that, that's still a long, long way away from actually appearing on our screens. They've still not even greenlit the pilot. Casting and then filming and then post-editing the pilot will take at least 6 months, if not a year, and then it'll take again another year or so to actually film a season. So our first prequel content is not going to happen, I suspect, until 2021. So if I were you, the current favorite, this isn't a prediction, but the current favorite is that we will see our first prequel April 2021, the Blood Moon / Long Night prequel from Jane Goldman. So that's where we're at with that. In terms of the Winds of Winter, no updates. George R. R. Martin, the last he said, he actually gave an interview quite recently about his writing style, which made it very clear that he's still very much caught up in it, but his brain is wandering onto other things, as it does. The latest that he has said is that if that he wants it and he expects it to be done by the time he goes to Worldcon in New Zealand next year, which is in summer, I think July, but don't quote me on it. I'm sure somebody in the chat will know for sure. Now, he said this kind of thing many times, but I think that this is indicative of the fact that he is, in his mind, months rather than years away from completing it. So that's where we're at. It's where I think we've been at now for some time. But yeah, maybe this time next year, who knows? I predicted this time this year. So Winds of Winter is not here, and until we hear any further news, then I think we just have to wait. So that's where we're at in terms of updates on those things. Liam Mullen, thank you so much. That very generous super chat saying, congratulations on 25 million, and here's to 25 more. Thank you. I really appreciate that. Thank you, guys, and lots of very kind messages in the chat as well. Let's Mark Hatton, actually, good question in the chat saying, what sort of timescale are we looking at from initial announcement to release of the book? It depends when they initially announce it, but it's not going to happen straight away. If he says he's finished it, then we're still probably looking at a few months. It will go to the editors. They may well have some edits down. They won't be telling him to change the story, but they may well be pointing out a few things that he didn't spot, inaccuracies or something he didn't spot. So there'll be a clearance process there, and I am sure that they will wish to get it translated into various other languages. They will want to get it as an audiobook, and they will want to time it so this is going to be a mass event, a huge event in sort of literary publishing, and so they will try and make sure that it happens at the best possible time, which usually is late November or early December in time for Christmas. But so it's not clear. There's not a clear time scale, but when he says he's finished writing it, do not expect it to appear next week. It will still be a few months after that, probably, before we actually see it in our hands. And it has to be published and distributed and all the rest of it, obviously, as well. And Tubbs 1971, no, George has said nothing new. He hasn't said he's going to finish the book. I was just answering a question about what the latest is that we've heard. So Brennan Barnes over on Patreon asked a question connected to the original question about Essos and Westeros, saying, I have a similar question. I'd love to hear your opinion on the seeming parallels between Essos and Westeros. Westeros has the Children of the Forest, White Walkers, Weirwoods, etc. And Essos has those who walk in the wood, shade of the evening trees, and whatever the five forts guard against. The Disputed Lands really opened my eyes with her essay and video on the startling similarities between the Weirwoods and the shade of the evening trees. Love the channel. Looking forward to more well-told tales. Well, thank you. I'll talk about the well-told tale in a moment. So this is I told you we got some fantastic questions here. This is about the sort of the history and similarities between Westeros and Essos. Now, there are a few things we probably all know about the Children of the Forest and weirwood trees and so on. In Essos, there is the shade of the evening tree, which appears to be a sort of a parallel and an opposite to the weirwood tree. Now, you mentioned the Disputed Lands did a great video on this. Always recommend going to see the Disputed Lands. I'm sure if you're watching live, someone will drop a link in the chat. Always trying to get her back onto this channel as often as I can. But at a sort of a high level, we have, so they were the trees in the books before Dany goes into the House of the Undying and has those visions. She has to drink from the shade of the evening trees, or the sort of the the juice from the shade of the evening trees, which the description of it is very, very similar to what Bran experiences when he's drinking the sort of the sap of the weirwood trees north of the wall. So it sounds very similar. Their descriptions are very similar in terms of opposites. So weirwood trees are sort of white bark with red leaves, and so the shade of the evening trees are sort of black and blue, and they're sort of like opposites. Euron has a whole sort of like parallel approach going on there. He sees visions, sees things in the future or things that might be when he drinks from the shade of the evening tree. So yes, there's these kind of clear parallels. The other thing you mentioned there is slightly more obscure, so some people might not be aware. Those who walk in the wood. Now, this is a legend in Essos. It's a legend of the Dothraki, of a race of people who lived there before, who were wood dwellers. They were short, they were generally quite peaceful, and they've now died out. And basically, yes, they sound very similar to the Children of the Forest. Indeed, one of their old settlements, the Dothraki left, and so it's like abandoned. And I think Corlys Velaryon, who, if you've read Fire and Blood, you will remember, this great explorer, seafarer, he went there and he talks about carved trees and things like that. So the links across to the Children of the Forest are very clear. And the Five Forts, this kind of apparent barrier guard, sort of way of guarding the eastern end of Essos, has the same kind of feel as the wall to the north of Westeros. So the point that Brennan, I think you're making, is that there are similarities between these two, between Westeros and Essos. It's just we know lots about Westeros, but we don't hear it about Essos so much. Now, what does this mean? My view, well, first of all, George R. R. Martin hasn't given us enough to come to a complete firm conclusion. We should probably be open about that. There are hints, there are legends, there are stories. No characters have ever gone off to the Five Forts. These are just like things that we hear about in the sort of the world of Ice and Fire and stuff like that. So it's not, we don't have huge amounts of first-hand information about these places. But the impression, or my working assumption, is that there were some equivalent of Children of the Forest over in Essos. Essos and Westeros apparently used to be joined by the land bridge across from Dawn across to the disputed lands. So that shouldn't surprise us too much. So there used to be Children of the Forest. They used to carve trees. There is a tree that seems very similar to the weirwoods, but perhaps seems like twisted and torn and almost as if it's been cut off from the main weirwood network. So my working guess is something along the lines of there were Children of the Forest there were equivalent of weirwoods, but humans, in the same way that they moved straight across Westeros and destroyed the forests and all the rest of it, the same thing happened in Essos. Essos is a huge continent, but you'll find huge swathes of it, particularly the Dothraki, just wiped it clean. It's not that the people just did not survive. Whoever was there just didn't last, and there are lots of lost cultures in Essos of the hairy men, for example, that nobody really knows who the hairy men might be, and there are things like in the maze makers and all the rest of it that people just don't know what was there. It's very clear that there was some past that has been largely wiped out by humanity's advance across Essos, and then at some point the land bridge was destroyed in some way. Perhaps it was the Children of the Forest who did it, And this cut off Essos from the main Weirwood network and from the rest of the Children of the Forest. So that seems to be what's going on there. It's we don't have the full information, but it does seem to be that there were similar creatures, if not exactly Children of the Forest, on both continents. And George R. R. Martin is deliberately showing us that those echoes are there in both places, which is partly, I think, hinting to us that these events are not just Westeros events, the Long Night and all the rest of it. They're not just Westeros events, they're whole world events. And this does indeed link across to the seasons. So this is all about telling us, showing us again and again that this is a whole world problem. It's not just a, pardon me, not just a one continent problem. We did have a super chat before we went on air, actually, from Maura Lee. Thank you so much, Maura. That was incredibly generous, saying, just a show of love and support for all the excellent content on both channels. Looking forward to more of the Mountain of Madness on the Well Told Tale and more of the Traveler's Guide. Maura also did a super sticker. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. So will you be doing a Traveler's Guide through Middle Earth? Yeah, I'm looking into this, so I'm going to finish off. We've still got many weeks to go on the Traveller's Guide through Essos. We're going to lease this Friday, and then we're on to Volantis, and then sort of deeper into Essos to Slaver's Bay and beyond. So there's still quite a lot of the Traveller's Guide to Essos to be doing. But yeah, I quite like to do one of Middle Earth. My only hesitation is that I know that the Tolkien estate are very firm on copyright and things like that. So I just need to make sure that I stay the right side of the law in what I'm doing there. But yes, that's something I'm very much looking forward to. You also mentioned the Well Told Tale. I'm going to sort of tease it here, but there's going to be an announcement about the Well Told Tale. I'm very aware that I'm a couple of weeks behind on there. That's because I'm doing a whole lot of stuff behind the scenes on that. So keep an eye out on the Well Told Tale about what's going to be coming up, because it's something I'm really excited about, something that I was planning on doing right from the beginning, but it's sort of expanding out as well on the Well Told Tale. So do keep an eye out on that. Stephen Stark, thank you so much, saying, if you hit the like button, I'll give you a cookie. Stephen Stark is a man of his word, so go for it. Maura also followed on by saying, in your last Tower of Joy video, so actually, sorry, I just slightly got distracted by a question in the chat from Liat Rubenfeld saying, has George mentioned whether or not Blood Moon will include Essos? No, he hasn't specifically, but the implication from everything that he's been saying is that this is a huge world, and it's not just the places we know and all the rest of it. And some of the, as you know, I don't really go in for sort of set pictures and all the rest of it, but some of the information we've been getting does seem to suggest that yes, we might be getting some stuff from Essos, and that is entirely right, because the two continents weren't separate. There was trading between the two of them. Old Town in Westeros was the biggest city in Westeros all through this period. King's Landing, only really recent, just 300 years old. Old Town, thousands of years old. And that had been a trading post with Essos and beyond for millennia. So yes, I would be surprised if we do not see anything from Essos in Blood Moon. So to follow up on this, in your last Tower of Joy video about Ned and broken promises, you mentioned a possible comparison between Ned and his broken promise to tell Jon about his true heritage to the breaking of the sword ice to form Widow's Wail and Oathkeeper. How do you think Jon will learn the truth of who his parents were and by whom? And then there's some follow-up, but I'll just slightly pick up on the first bit. So yeah, if you've not found it yet, yesterday I released the latest of my Robert's Rebellion series, the Tower of Joy sort of explanations that I do about what was going on in that whole period. And this one was asking the question, what did Ned actually promise Lyanna, or what did she get him to promise her? Because we kind of think we know. We kind of have this idea, yeah, it's something along the lines of protect Jon, make sure Robert Baratheon doesn't kill him, or da-da-da-da-da. But we don't know exactly what it is. And it's clear from the text that he made more than one promise to her. So this is trying to unpack what those promises might be, and why, when he was in the black cells at the end of his life, why did he suddenly feel remorse? Why did he still feel he had to talk to Jon? Why was he having dreams about broken promises? So if you're at all interested in that and just trying to tidy up what was actually going on there, what it was that Ned actually promised to do, that video came out yesterday, so do go and have a look at that. Now, one of the things I said just at the very end was something that I will happily say I shamelessly stole. I did give them a credit to the myth heads. If there are any myth heads out there watching this, a fantastic community within the Game of Thrones community, who've done a lot of work thinking about the symbolism of A Song of Ice and Fire and what's going on there. And broken words, broken vows, are very often connected with broken swords. There's a bit of wordplay there between broken word and broken sword, of course, but when you take Ned's sword, Ice, after he died, that was broken, and it was broken into two parts. And one of the swords it became was Widow's Wail, which immediately makes us think of Liana and her Widow's Wail. And the second one was Oathkeeper. And I think that the kind of the symbolism there for Ned and what was going on at the Tower of Joy is really strong. So that's where I was going on there. And then I suggested that, yes, Jon will learn his true identity, even if Ned couldn't tell him who he was. Jon will discover, in the same way on the show, of course, he learned from a sort of combination of Bran and Sam. They figured it out and got the information to him. In the books, my gut instinct, it's going to be one of two people. Howland Reed. Many of you know I'm slightly obsessed with Howland Reed. He will return. George R. R. Martin has told us that he will return. He knows exactly what's going on. He will have the information. The other possibility is Benjen, who, if he returns in the same sort of way that he returned on the show, then perhaps he will also, I'm convinced Benjen knows Jon's true identity. So that's another possibility about who might tell Jon. Mora follows up by saying, if Jon learns the truth from Benjen, will this be a way that Ned would finally be able to fulfill his promise? Yes, absolutely. And to follow up on that sword thing, and I think this is fascinating. I love the symbolism of this. Might Ned's sword be reforged in the same way that we get in Lord of the Rings, we get Narsil, the sword that was broken, reforged? Might we therefore get the ice reforged? Now, this is something that I have discussed a couple of times on this channel, on these live streams. I can remember having a discussion with Joe Magician about this, actually. Joe hopefully we'll be back on this channel again very soon. Now, his view was very much along these lines. Yes, this makes so much poetic sense for this to be reforged. There are many people who think this might be Lightbringer or something along those lines. My view is a lot more practical. If you have two Valyrian steel swords which can destroy White Walkers, why would you forge them together to make just one? And ice itself we have to be clear, it's not a weapon made for war. This was a ceremonial sword that was used. It was very long, I mean, all Valyrian steel swords are lighter than they should be, but very heavy, quite unwieldy. So this was a sword for executions and the like, rather than for combat. So my view then, and I think probably still now, is that during the story, I do not think ice will be reforged. However, afterwards, I think there's every possibility. So the two halves of ice on the show were held by Jaime and Brienne, and obviously at the end of it, Jaime is dead, so half of ice is up for grabs, and Brienne actually leaves the service of House Stark and takes on new service as a member of the Kingsguard, as a kind of an echo of Sir Duncan the Tall. So that leaves potentially the two halves of ice ready to be reforged. So I think that it might be quite a symbolic ending, or part of the ending of the stories, for it to be reforged, but not for the battle, just for the just sort of the symbolism at the end. That's where I'm currently at. I'm very happy to be debated about that, but that's what seems to make sense to me at the moment. Stephen Toth in the chat. I'm just picking up a few random things in the chat as I'm going through. Stephen Toth says, what's your prediction for where Winds of Winter will leave off as far as the story? Would it even get to Dany in the north? Sorry for blowing up the chat with this question, but I'm really curious. So I am going to, at some point in the next month or so, I'm going to start a new series with my predictions for the Winds of Winter about what's going to happen. But how far the story will advance is a fascinating question. So for Dany, she is currently a long way away from the north and all the rest of it. So her story has to have at least a couple of chapters up with the Dothraki. We'll need to see her. She's literally only just got captured by them, or is about to be captured by them. So she'll need to go through that whole storyline that we saw there in season, whatever it was, 6, perhaps, I can't remember. And with her coming back with the burning the Carls, returning with the Khalasar, then she needs to have a whole series of encounters when she's in Meereen, because there are a huge amount of people who've arrived there trying to help her out. I'll talk about that a little bit more in just a moment, because I've got a question about it. Then after that, there are 2 or 3 other places that she may decide that she wants to go off and burn, perhaps some of the slaver cities around Slaver's Bay. She may want to go off and take out places like Volantis and Pentos. There are hints that she might go off and do those things. Then she'll have to head over to Westeros. I think taking up home in Dragonstone makes sense in the books as it did on the show. And she's got the whole business of probably, I think, facing off against Aegon in King's Landing. I think that's as far as they can get, to be honest, in one book. Because that's a huge amount of story. Yes, it's going to be a massive book. Yes, I still think that it will be broken down into 2, because otherwise it'll just be literally too big to be one book. The binding wouldn't work on a book that big. But I do not think that she will be in a place to be heading north. However, the balance of that is that I think that the war will come further south than it did on the show. In the show, it all ended up really quite far up in the north with Winterfell. Dany's had a vision where she's flying over, having a battle over the Ruby Ford, basically in what is the thematic center of this story that we've got, this area around Harrenhal, the God's Eye, the Isle of Faces, the Inn at the Crossroads, the Ruby Ford, all within just a few miles of each other, right effectively, figuratively in the center of Westeros. So I think that there's a very good chance that that is where she is going to be facing her combat with the Army of the Dead, rather than her going all the way up to Westeros. But we'll see. In short, no, I do not think that that she will be able to get all the way through the storyline she has to go through in Essos, and then the storyline she has to get through in the south of Westeros, and then head north before the end of the Winds of Winter. So we've got Nina Fabiano saying, what about the theory of Varys being a Blackfire? I'm going to do a video setting out, there's a whole conspiracy is probably the wrong way of putting it, but the whole Varys and Illyrio and Fagon story, I just want to do a video setting out exactly what's been going on there. So yes, it's entirely possible. I think it's probably more likely that Varys himself is a long descendant of a Targaryen. Illyrio, however, will have the Blackfire links through marriage. And that, I think, is where the link comes across. So either way, they are supporting the Blackfire pretender, but pretending that the Blackfire pretender is actually a Targaryen. That's the high-level thing of what I think is going on with that. If you're a conspiracy theorist in terms of Varys, there is some fantastic language that George R. R. Martin uses in the chapter that he sort of gets introduced in Game of Thrones, where he's being described as being bald as an egg, which is apparently a reference, could be a reference to Aegon V, who we know from the Dunk and Egg stories. And then Cat thinks to herself, only a Targaryen understands the secrets of the Red Keep, and then Varys appears and says, I understand the secrets of the Red Keep. And you go, huh, okay, are you secretly a Targaryen? So there are hints there from George R. R. Martin, but he never actually kind of like teases it out so much. For what it's worth, I think Varys's backstory is pretty much what he says it is. I don't think he's trying to hide some big secret. I think he is pretty much who he says it is. Okay, let's go on to a question from well, we've got a couple of questions from about Ashara and Howland. Leaf Underhill, I saw you in the chat saying that you popped something over on Patreon. I just picked it up. I've not had a chance to think about it properly yet, but I will get to it in just one moment. But we'll start off with Chase. Hi, Chase, saying, if we believe, which I do, you convinced me, good, I'm pleased, that Ashara is the mother of Howland's children and went with him to the Neck, do you think her family knew about it? Maybe Ned made it possible for her to return to the north with them. After returning, Dawn and the Danes were so grateful for his help they named their heir after him. Or do you think Ashara's family actually believes she dies? For those who don't know, one of my theories, it's not my original theory, many other cleverer and more wonderful people than me came out with this originally, but I've put my own spin on it, is that Howland Reed and Ashara Dane were an item. And their eldest child is Mira Reed, who was born at roughly the same time as John was. Now, I think that she went up with Howland to Greywater Watch and is probably still there in Greywater Watch, hiding away, and that her death by suicide was a cover. That's my general thesis. If you want to, I did a video on it. If you want to get the all the reasons for me thinking that, because if it's the first time you've heard that, it does feel slightly random, taking two characters and saying, oh, maybe they got together. But I think that there's a pretty solid basis for this feeling. But Chase's question is, did the Danes know about this, about what was going on, or did they actually think that she committed suicide? Now, I'm going to pick up on this in more detail in my next video on Robert's Rebellion, the Tower of Joy. I said that with slight hesitation in my voice because it depends whether there are a couple of questions. This is a digression. Apologies. I will come back to the point in just 1 second. But there are a couple more points still to pick up on in the Tower of Joy. Namely, why didn't Ned take the bodies of his bannermen back north? And what on earth was happening with the pulling down the Tower of Joy? Did that actually happen? I think I can probably round those couple of issues up with this next video, but if not, I might make a video on separate on those issues because they really are quite fascinating. And in fact, the question which has vexed me the most all the way through this is, why didn't Ned take the bodies of his bannermen north? But as I say, that was an aside. I will be looking at this whole issue of what happened at Starfall in my next video on Robert's Rebellion. But the short answer is that we don't know huge amounts about the Danes, and this is in terms of sort of the information we have. In terms of first-hand accounts, we've got a few people's memories of Arthur and Ashara. So we have Ned vaguely remembers, we get Jamie remembers Arthur, and we get Mira and Jojen telling basically what their father's story about Ashara Dane. So we only get a few hints about those original characters. Then in terms of sort of the modern day during the story itself, with the Danes, we get Darkstar, who's just like a distant cousin, and then we get Ned Dane, who is the heir but actually quite young and only has heard of the stories secondhand, so to speak. So he didn't see anything, he's just heard what people have said to him. And it's pretty clear from that the story around the Danes was held up, that she did indeed commit suicide, but I don't think that necessarily means that she did, or that the Danes as a whole didn't know. Now, I think what happened was that the conspirators, being Ned and Howland and Ashara, when they got there, they will have tried to keep the circle of people who knew what was going on as small as possible. So it's possible that a couple of the key members of House Dane did know what was going on, but most people in the household did not. Most people in the household were told the story that they concocted there about what happened, and Ashara Dane going. The fact that Ashara Dane's body was not found is something that George R. R. Martin has specifically clarified out of this. It's not something that he's just sort of vaguely thought about. He said, yeah, she's said to have flung herself from the highest tower, but her body was never found, and that is deliberately suspicious. So I think that, yes, she went up with Howland Reed to the neck. I think that possibly a couple of members of House Dane were aware of what was going on, but the household as a whole were not aware of what was going on, because that was important for them to be part of this wider lack of understanding or lack of knowledge about what was going on with Ned. And John, I should say. And if Ned was there willing to not tell his own wife what was going on, then I think we can be reasonably sure that Ashara would have been able to not tell the people she was closest to what was going on. Now, as a sort of a counterpoint to that, Leaf Underhill, thank you, and welcome, quite a relatively new patron, saying, I believe your Ashara and Howland theory up to the point where the Danes decide they prefer to have everyone think that she bore a stillborn child out of wedlock and killed herself rather than that she married the father of her child. The Lord of the Neck is still... whatever people might think of the Cranagman, Howland is still an important lord, and marrying the father of your child is better than suicide. And even if people knew she was at Greywater Watch, then they couldn't just pop in to ask her questions. Can you explain why the Danes would let people think the things gossip says instead of telling the truth that she actually married Howland? Okay, so I think this is a fair challenge, and I think this ties into where I was at before. I'm going to tighten up my logic on this, and when I come to my next video, I approach, I'm sure I've said this before, I approach all of my videos with an open mind. I don't go in there thinking, right, now I have to prove X, Y, Z. I'm going in with a working thesis. It may well be that I, having read through everything, I come to a slightly different conclusion. But as it stands, where I'm at is that no, the Danes as a whole probably did not know what was going on, because that's, you know, how the Dane household wouldn't have been aware. They were also very closely tied in with Rhaegar, and I think that we can't sort of underestimate this. Is so Arthur Dane and Rhaegar were that close. They were absolutely best buddies. Ashara Dane, as well as being Arthur Dane's brother, was also handmaid to Elia Martell, Rhaegar's wife. So she was absolutely tied in with all of this that was going on. And it's entirely possible, given that Rhaegar was so virulent with his ideas, that his children were going to be the people to save humanity. Quite literally, that was what he thought was going on. He thought that he was on this great mission to be saving humanity, and his children were the way that this was going to happen. If Arthur and Ashara were going along with this, then they must have bought into it at least somehow. So they thought that what was at stake was not just a matter of saving a child. They thought that what they were doing was playing their small part in saving humanity. So this is not, suddenly this turns from being just a sort of a court drama of whether or not somebody's got sort of thought more or less of because of who they marry. Suddenly this is a matter of how do we protect the last person, as far as we can tell, who is potentially going to be the savior of humanity. How do we go about doing that? And the way that the plan they seem to have come up with is tell no one. This has to be an absolute secret. If you watched a couple of videos ago, I personally think the most logical thing is for Arthur Dane to have committed suicide in order to protect this secret. Ashara Dane probably faked her own death and hid away in Greywater Watch. I think that they were that close to Rhaegar that they probably did, at least to some degree, and probably to quite a high degree, buy into his idea that they were not just dealing with trying to save a baby from a king's wrath. They were here trying to save the potential savior of humanity. So that's my sort of answer here, is it's not just a matter of them trying to save a little face and what would actually look best. It's actually they sat down. If we imagine Ned and Howland arrive and sit down with Ashara Dane, and they figure out what is it that we have to do, what is our plan, how do we go about doing this, how do we actually save this child, and whether Ned buys into this idea of John being the savior of humanity, that's by the by. Howland Reed was in contact with Bloodraven. He's been playing his games. He knew what they were trying to do. Bloodraven, another video I'm going to do, probably the last in the series, is how Bloodraven was pulling all the strings on this one. And I think that Ashara Dane very much was probably bought into the Rhaegar perspective on this. So these people decided what happened. It wasn't just a matter of what's the best way of saving face for House Dane. This was a matter of how do we actually go about saving this child for the good of all humanity. That's my take anyway. As I say, you will get my more refined take in a few weeks' time with my next video in the series. Ellen, thank you so much for the super chat, saying, what do you think Ned's plan was if Robert never asked him to be hand concerning telling John the truth? I think he would have never told him. So this is, I always spoil my videos on these things. So my take is that one of the promises that Liana made Ned make was that he would tell John who his parents were when it was safe. I think that everything seems to add up to this as being something that Ned promised. Now, in terms of his, he's an honourable man and would have done so at some point. He doesn't seem to have thought, this is books, not show. Show, I think, is very different. In terms of the books, Benjen seems to come up with this idea of John going to the wall, and it seems to be something that Ned hasn't particularly thought of before. He takes some time, he thinks it through, then he sighs deeply and says, I suppose that will be for the best. So Ned's plan, my best guess, is that at some point, perhaps when Robert Baratheon had died, he would tell John who his true parents were. I think that's what the plan was. I don't think he'd figured out exactly when and where and how, but because he knew that at any point, if he'd done that while Robert Baratheon was alive, then John would be in danger. So I think that was the situation that was going on there. I don't think he got a hard and fast plan. He just had said that he was going to do it. Michaela S, thank you so much, saying just showing love and support to the channel. Thank you, I really appreciate that. Let's take, I always take a little break partway through my live streams just to let you know what's going on with the channel and slightly more widely. So I've already talked a little bit about the video that came out yesterday, the latest in my Robert's Rebellion series. Just so you know, going forward, the plan is to sort of alternate. I'm going to carry on with the Traveler's Guide. I'm going to be carrying all the live streams. So that's Thursday and Friday sorted. I'm going to alternate every other week. I'm going to be doing either a Song of Ice and Fire video or a Tolkien video. So the next one coming out next week on Tolkien is looking at Numenor. We keep on hearing about this kind of famed Atlantis kind of place. What is it? What role does it have in the Legendarium? Why is it still important? Because it is still important in the time of the Lord of the Rings. How might it fit in with what's going on with the Amazon TV show when it happens? So that's what's going to the next Lord of the Rings Tolkien video is going to be. In terms of the well-told tale, I've already said I've got what I think is quite an exciting announcement coming up in the next couple of weeks, so keep an eye out for that. Merchandise. I think I saw Chrissy of Oldstones. Chrissy, thank you so much for being an amazing moderator. Drop a link down there. There's also a link down in the description. If you do want to get any Deep Geek merchandise, feel free to go and have a look at the shop. There's mugs, there's tote bags, there's t-shirts, there's you name it, lots of different things going on there. And my plans for the merchandise is that at the moment it's just Deep Geek branded stuff, but I'm looking to expand that out to get some quite exciting stuff, hopefully doing a few collaborations to try and get some good quality stuff coming out over the course of the next few months. So that's there. The other thing that I always say, because I always mean it, is patrons, thank you. I cannot do what I do without your support. I truly appreciate it. I'm proactively looking for more benefits that I can find from my patrons. If you are a $10 patron and you sent me your address by the end of last month, then we are sending you out mugs as we speak. A free mug just as a thank you for your support. There are other things that I'm looking to be doing, other audio narrations I'm looking to be providing for all of my patrons. So keep an eye out for future things coming forward. If you are interested in supporting the channel, the best way to do it is through Patreon. There's a link down in the description. Or if you just want to get access to some stuff I just do for my patrons, like chances to vote on what videos I do, or priority access on questions for my live streams, or all manner of things. I do audio narrations of things like the pre-release chapters from the Winds of Winter. Go and check it out if you're at all interested. Link down in the description. Marcus Aurelius, thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for the super chat, saying, if Ashara still lives, do you think the child she was rumored to have lost also lives? Any ideas on who this second secret baby could be? Yeah, I think that is Mira Reed. I think that we're told that she was born in the same year, around the same time as John and Rob. So she's of an age there. This is one of the things with Howland Reed, is that if that's the case, if she is his child, and we've no reason to doubt that she is his child, then he has to have been with the mother 9 months or so before the Tower of Joy, and that means that it's probably somebody that we're aware of, because we're told that he was with Ned's army all the way through that war. And so it's not just some wife or random woman he had left in Greywater Watch because he wasn't there. This is somebody he met while he was out at war. Yeah, I think that there's every hint is that this is Mira Reed, and that Jojen came a little bit later. Okay, let's go to another question from Patreon. This is Casey of House Lawbridge, who says, what's your take on Lady Stoneheart? Which is a nice broad question, so I shall just give you my nice broad take on Lady Stoneheart. So Lady Stoneheart, I think, is pretty much what we think she is. So she book spoilers. So she's Catelyn Stark back from the dead. Now, what we understand about people coming back from the dead is that they lose a lot of themselves. The more times they come back from the dead, this happens with Beric Dondarrion, or the time, the longer they are not alive. So when she comes back, having been dead for a few days, then she has lost a lot of herself. What remains is this thing that she was clinging on to most, this desire for vengeance against the people who have wronged her family. And so what she is doing is that she is now leading a bunch of people in the Riverlands, hunting down and trying to enact justice upon the people who caused her family so much pain, which are the Freys, the Lannisters, and all the people like that. So I think that is pretty much where she's at. I think that going forward, she is going to take on at least some of what we saw on the show as Arya's storyline in the Riverlands. I think that we're not just going to have Arya doing her sort of revenge mission in the Riverlands. We're going to have Lady Stoneheart doing it. I think that there's a 50-50 chance that Lady Stoneheart might be the person who actually takes out the Freys rather than Arya. I think that... and the final thing I think that with Lady Stoneheart is because actually, sorry, take it one step back. George R. R. Martin has been clear that her character was the one that he was most disappointed wasn't on the show. Now, that's not on the basis, I suspect, of what she's done so far in the books, which is noteworthy, but it's not a game changer. So what she's going to do later on in the books has to be some sort of a game changer. And I think her taking on a lot of Arya's role in the show, taking out the phrase and so on, that will be the kind of thing which will be the game changer, which will be the kind of thing which show us why George R. R. Martin was wanting her to be on the show as well as in the books. Now, the other thing I would say on that is she is driven by a desire for revenge on the people who have wronged her family. Now, in her mind, of her children, Robb is dead. She's heard that Bran and Rickon are dead. Sansa has gone missing. Arya also went missing and was last heard of being married off to the Boltons. That's where she's at. Now, a point will come when she discovers that actually, yes, Robb was betrayed and murdered in front of her eyes. That did happen. The Freys and the Lannisters are to blame for that. But actually, Bran and Rickon aren't dead. They didn't die in the way that she has thought. Sansa is, I was going to say safe, but as safe as anyone can be with a little finger, but she's certainly not dead. And Arya is not the person that everyone's pretending that she is. She's actually also safe-ish over in Braavos. So actually, her story arc has to end the moment that she feels that she has enacted vengeance for what was done to her family. And that means enacting vengeance for the Red Wedding, taking out the Freys in some way, the Lannisters in some way, and discovering that her children are actually, or most of her children are actually still alive. So that is where her character arc is going to go. She's going to be spending most of the next book, I humbly predict, in the Riverlands enacting her vengeance. And then at some point she will come to the realization that the Starks, her children, are still alive. And that hopefully will bring her some kind of catharsis or completion. But we shall have to see. Julie Miller, thank you so much for the super sticker saying keep it up. Thank you. I really appreciate that. Kate Bertinsky saying, I'm pretty sure Mira is a little older than Robb, as she was almost 16 in A Clash of Kings, soon after Robb turned 15, so Howland might have married a Crannog woman just before the banners were called. I don't think so. Howland Reed, I don't think that timing quite works out. I would have to go back and look at my timeline. I don't have it right in front of me. What George R. R. Martin has said is that all of that time, then Howland was with Ned. Now, Howland presumably joined up with Ned when he was going down south through the Neck. We're not told this for sure. But presumably he joined up with him as he was heading down south during the Neck. Therefore, he left a good month or so before Robb was conceived, and I think that probably makes it most unlikely. That's just my take on it. But yeah, I think that Mira was born. That they're very vague about this. We're just told that they're about the same age. Mira Reed being the sword of the morning, I can dig it, says Danny McKay. Yeah, I like that. Mira, I think it adds a certain extra element to it if you take Mira and Jojen as not just being sort of random people from the Neck, but actually they know a huge amount. It's one of the things I think you can extrapolate a lot from is their surprise about the fact that Bran Stark had never been told the story of that Howland told about Ashara. It is Howland telling a story about Ashara. It's ostensibly about the turning at Harrenhal, but really, when you look into it, this is quite a story about Ashara. Everyone else gets given these nicknames based upon their house sigils and all the rest of it, like the young pup, or the dragon prince, or something, or the white sword, or something like that. But she is the maiden, and he is the lad. So it's a story about the two of them. Everyone else doesn't get much of a description, but we hear about her hair and the color of her eyes. We hear about every single person that she danced with that night. This is if this isn't a How I Met Your Mother story, this is a very creepy thing for Howland Reed to be recounting to his children in a kind of a, oh yeah, and just before I met your mother, I met this really hot woman, and let me tell you what the color of her eyes was. Let me tell you who she danced with that night. It's a really weird story for him to repeatedly tell his children. So I think that for me, it seems very clear that that was a story about how Howland met Ashara, and it kind of ties in with the fact that Ned banned mention of Ashara up in Winterfell, so of course he hasn't told the story, because it's a story about Ashara. It's not a story about the Tower of Joy. Anyway, slight digression. Donna Daly says, it took an army of actual dragons for the Valyrians to defeat the Rhoynar. Do you think that the Dornish could take out Dany's dragons? Do I think that the Dornish could take out Dany's dragons? That's a good question. So the Dornish have got a track record of fighting against dragons, but their way of fighting against dragons, this is in the Dornish Wars, was not just to go head on against them, but when the dragons came, they just melted away into the mountains. So the dragons could go away and burn things from up above, and it didn't make much difference to the Dornish, because once the dragons had gone away, the Dornish reappeared and just carried on with their guerrilla warfare. So do I think that the Dornish could take out Dany's dragons? Well, they did take out one dragon in that war, so it's entirely possible. The way that George R. R. Martin tends to talk about people taking out dragons just from like shooting at them is it's kind of like it's a 1 in a million shot. Yes, if you keep on shooting at dragons, eventually you will. But it's not like we saw on the show where you get Euron shooting at a dragon and 2 or 3 things go straight through it. It's not that easy. This is a really hard thing to do, to shoot a dragon down from the sky. But the Dornish have done it, so yes, they potentially could. And I think that it's entirely possible that a dragon will get shot down, but we're not supposed to think that it's easy. Lisa Lowe, thank you so much for the super chat, saying bumping up Sarah Norrie's question. I love it when people do this with super chats, is asking a question on behalf of someone else. So thank you, Lisa. That's very generous of you. Could Lady Stoneheart meet up with Recomm in the books? It could be interesting. Yes, it's possible, but so in the geography kind of plays against it. Is the issue. So Lady Stoneheart is down in the Riverlands at the moment, and Rickon is almost certainly on Skagos, which is this island off of the northeast coast of Westeros. So almost as high as the Wall, that kind of area. He will be gathered, the hints are, by Davos, who's got a very different storyline in the books in this part than he did on the show, and brought back because, as it stands, he is the Stark that people could rally around to be the Stark at Winterfell. Because Bran has clearly disappeared. They don't know where he is. Robb has died. Arya isn't Arya, and Sansa's disappeared. So if you're going to get a Stark, they've tried to tempt Jon, but if you're going to get a Stark for everyone to rally around, then Rickon's the best bet. So that's what seems to be going on. So his storyline seems to be very likely to be taken, and he's going feral as far as we could tell, but taken over towards Winterfell to be this kind of trophy Stark that everybody can try and rally behind. But as with the show, and as his direwolf's name suggests, I think it's entirely likely, in fact, almost certain, that his story is going to be a long and complicated one, and very diverting and interesting, but will ultimately end in a slightly meaningless and anticlimactic way. I think that that's what's going to happen. So because his story is going to be up in the north, and Lady Stoneheart is mostly based, as we talked about a moment ago, in the Riverlands and enacting judgment and vengeance against people in the Riverlands, I think that, yes, theoretically they could, but this is still, it's 1,000 miles or more between them, which is a very long way, particularly with winter setting in, and I think it's probably unlikely that they actually will meet. Good question, though. Thank you. Raya says anything would be better than his anticlimactic end in the show. Yeah, I mean, I agree. Anything would work better than that, but I think that is the feel, as we will probably find quite a lot with the book and the show, is that the show might get it sort of right, but it doesn't quite get it right. Is so he will die in an anticlimactic way. It will be a way that goes, oh, that's really annoying and stupid. I think that's the feeling that we're going to get in the books as well. I don't think it will be the exact same way, but I think that that's the same kind of feel. So prepare yourself for that. I think that that's where Rickon is going to be ending up. People asking me, Daniel Maranti saying, do you like The Expanse? People ask me this a lot. I wish I did. I mean, I've never read the books. I've been told that they are fantastic. I have watched one episode of The Expanse, and it didn't immediately grab me. I hear that it gets really good later. So at some point when I have some time, I will settle myself down in and have a proper binge through season one. But as it stands, I've not yet got into it. So people whose view I trust tell me that it's well worth my effort doing that, and I will at some point. I, like everyone else, have got a long list of things I'm wanting to get through, so that is definitely on the list. Yeah, I hear it's great, but I haven't got into it. Let's go to a question from one of my patrons, Maura Lee, saying, compare and contrast the magic and the magic users in the A Song of Ice and Fire series with the Lord of the Rings series. I told you we'd be dotting around a little bit on this one. So I've talked about this a few times, so I'll sort of give a few headlines here. So the way that George R.R. Martin and J.R.R. Tolkien approach magic is on one level very similar, in that they both buy into this idea of magic having a cost, and that doesn't always come across in Lord of the Rings. It does very strongly in A Song of Ice and Fire. You'll see that, you know, when people are casting spells, they have to make sacrifices in some way and all the rest of it. If you, and I reread Lord of the Rings recently, and I was actually keeping an eye out for this, you find particularly characters like Gandalf, they do kind of mention the cost in a kind of a throwaway way. He talks about saying, I could when he's facing the Balrog, I could cast this spell effectively, but it would leave me absolutely knackered and I wouldn't be able to do anything for a long time afterwards. I don't think that's the best use of my strength right now. And then he carries on talking. So, and it's a little better language than that. I was paraphrasing, but he does this a few times. He talks about, having to decide when to use magic and when not to use magic. It's not just a thing that he can just do without any cost attached to it. The cost appears to be sort of like tiring him out as much as anything else. So there's one level that's there. In terms of the sort of the way that magic works, there's also this kind of idea of magical beings which are there. Dragons, obviously, in both, so that's very similar as well. And they don't seem to. It just seems normal to them to do what they do. That's just the magic is imbued within them in some way. And magical items. The magical items in Lord of the Rings seem slightly more obvious, whereas if you think about what is it actually magical about a Valyrian steel sword, you have to it lasts for a very long time. It's quite light. It's very sharp. These don't seem to be the kind of like hugely magical things like a sword that glows when orcs are near or whatever. That doesn't happen so much. So the things are very similar. However, what you get in Lord of the Rings is deliberately from the start a high fantasy setting. You're already told as a fact that there are dragons in the world, there are magicians. This is just the way the world is. Everyone knows it, everyone understands it. It's not a shock. Yes, you might be a little bit suspicious if a magician walks in into your neighborhood, but it's not. You don't disbelieve that they are. Game of Thrones was written very much. I'm talking book one here, from the perspective of magic is a thing and magical entities are viewed by the characters we are told are wise as being nonsense. Tyrion scoffs about there being any kind of magical creatures north of the wall. Maester Luwin says, there used to be magic in the world, but there isn't now. All the characters that we're presented as being wise effectively just say, nah, magic's not real anymore. And through the vast majority of that book, we don't actually see much by way of magic. It doesn't really happen just in the very first, the prologue, and right at the very end with the birth of Dany's dragons. Those are the things which are sort of bookending. Otherwise, no real magic. So it is like Tolkien's world, but it starts out as a very gritty, low fantasy world in the minds of the people who were there. And this is George R. R. Martin's way of writing, because his is from the perspective of individual people rather than Tolkien's way of writing, which is very much this kind of third person omniscient, just explaining how the world is. So that's my sort of high level breakdown of the differences between the two. So I'll just see if there's any quick questions in the Danny Moranti says Lord of the Rings is quasi-religious, i.e. evil is and there is a god. Yes, absolutely, this is true, and this is everything is very absolute in Tolkien's world. Yeah, I think that's a key difference, is that the gods are real, or the god is real in Tolkien's world, whereas in George R. R. Martin, he's been very clear. What matters to him is not the gods. We will never see the gods happen in A Song of Ice and Fire. What matters to him is how people react to various things. What is the impact of someone's faith on what they do? What matters is not whether or not the Lord of Light is real, what matters is the fact that Melisandre believes absolutely that the Lord of Light is real and does things because of that. So that's where George R. R. Martin comes from on all of this. Leaf Underhill says Alt-Shift-X has a good non-spoilery video explaining the world of The Expanse. Less than 10 minutes, if I recall correctly. Everything Alt-Shift-X does is excellent, so I shall have a look at that when I get a moment. Thank you very much. Christian Isidoro, fantastic question, this one, saying, hi, Robert, in my understanding of the story, and I believe you've commented similarly in the past, Ned seems to have been quite a progressive leader for the North. He built a sept for Catelyn, brought a scepter to the North to teach his children, commissioned statues of his siblings for their tombs, yet I don't recall any sense of disquiet because of these changes, although I'm sure some families perceived them as being radical. Ned seems to have been well loved and mourned after his death. Do you think that these changes may have contributed to the Boltons' seizure of Winterfell, with some families deciding to support the Boltons over the Starks? So I think this is I find this a fascinating question, because this is something that has nagged at me as well, is that Ned is indeed a bit of a rule breaker, a bit of the kind of person who sees traditions and just goes, yeah, I'm not doing that. Now, we see this, as you say, we see this in him doing statues for Liana and Brandon when they technically shouldn't have had statues in Winterfell's crypts. Him building a sept in Winterfell is one thing, but actually having a scepter brought up to teach his children is a very different thing, because it's effectively saying the next Lord of Winterfell is going to be dual faith in a way. Yes, worshipping the old gods, but having been brought up to understand and to a degree practice the faith of the Seven is a huge shift. So does that impact on how the rest of the North view him? Now, I don't think that would impact on some families. So, for example, you get the Manderleys. The Manderleys already worship the faith of the Seven, so I don't think that would make any difference to them. The Boltons have had a long-standing grudge against the Starks anyway, so I don't think it would affect them. Some families, like the Mormonts, we discovered in Fire and Blood, have got a blood tie into the Starks. So one of the Stark kings or lords married a Mormont. So don't think that would affect hugely. But there may well be other families out there who sort of take umbrage, not so much in the putting the statues up in Winterfell. That's a Stark thing, really, and yes, he could do it. That's a break in tradition, but it's not going to offend anyone else outside of the Starks. They would be more likely to be offended by things like Ned not bringing the bodies of his bannermen north after the Tower of Joy, as we see in the books when we get Barbry Dustin bears a grudge against Ned Stark. So that's the kind of thing which will be there. I think it's quite easy to overstate the stuff about having a sept there. I suspect that in the North, although yes, the Starks are in charge, a lot of the North is so distant, it's a really big place, that they just mind their own business and do their own thing. And he seems to have done a good job of being ruler. He's visited everywhere, and when he's met them and dispensed justice, it's been fair. So that seems to be what's been going on, is that there's a natural sort of liking for the Starks, added to which he seems to be an honourable person. Everybody seems to think that. So that was what was going on there. I don't think that those specific changes would contributed much. I don't think that there was a popular uprising to say, oh, that Ned Stark, he's some sort of heretic, we have to get rid of him. I think that what the people who opposed him was a combination more of long-standing grudges and opportunism. that seems to be more the case, rather than he did a specific thing that they took offense at as First Men and said, no, we shouldn't allow this to happen. So that seems to be more the case of what was going on. So, Michaela Smith, your content makes my day, and super excited to finally be a patron. Welcome, welcome to my patron. My question for you is: what are some things you are looking forward to in the Winds of Winter? So, this was a question I said I would come to this. There are two. There's lots of things I'm looking forward to in the Winds of Winter, but the two things I'm most looking forward to, other than just reading Tyrion chapters again, because I love reading Tyrion chapters, the first is what's going to happen with Jon at the Wall, because he was killed at the end of the last book, and he will have to come back, and I'm reasonably certain that we will get a chapter of him in Ghost, and that absolutely fascinates me how that would be. And then we will get a chapter of him being brought back, and that is also going to absolutely fascinate me. So that I'm really looking forward to. The second thing is Meereen, when Dany returns, because for those of us who pay far too much attention to George R. R. Martin's pronouncements about his writing, may remember when he was writing the last book a decade or more ago, he, in trying to explain the delays, talked about the Meereenese knot, which was basically his shorthand for saying huge amounts of people are descending upon Meereen, and he had to try and work out what order they all had to arrive in order for the story to work effectively, for Dany's story when she was in Meereen to be working effectively, and for everybody's individual stories to be working effectively. And he worked his way through that to allow him to be writing A Dance with Dragons, but when what's left is that we actually still have a huge amount of fascinating characters all arriving at Meereen at the same time. Just off the top of my head, Tyrion's just arriving there. So Jorah's arriving there. We've got Victarion arriving there. We've got who else have we got? Marwyn the Mage is going to be arriving there. Dany herself will be coming back there. I'm sure I've missed Makoro, the Red Priest, is going to be arriving there. There are so many people who are all going to be arriving at the same sort of time. And when Dany comes back, she's suddenly going to be faced not just with the handful of advisors that she had before, but the whole host of people that she has to try and figure out what to do about. And that, I think, will be absolutely fascinating. It's going to be because she will come back in some version of what happened before, with her dragons and having to sort of destroy forces attacking her city, but she will also be faced with, well, what do I do now with all of these people here who are trying to get a piece of me, and that is something that I think will be absolutely fascinating. I can't wait for. Kwame Tawia, apologies for mispronouncing your name. Thank you so much for the super chat saying, "Hi Robert, I have a theory you might like. It's about Brandon Stark and his bloody sword, and Jon who dreamed about his fiery sword. Do you think that's how it'll end for Dany? P.S. You're awesome." Well, thank you very much. So I don't know what the whole theory there is. I don't think that Brandon is Jon's father, if that's what you're suggesting. But in terms of the fiery sword, Jon did indeed have a dream about him holding a fiery sword and him standing on the wall, fighting away the army of the dead, effectively. Now, This is clearly an echo of the Azor Ahai myth, where Azor Ahai has to forge Lightbringer, this great sword that is going to somehow miraculously save humanity. And the way that he does that, he tempers it eventually by thrusting it into the chest of his lover, and that tempers the sword, and Lightbringer gives off light and fire. And so that's the sort of the image that we've got. That is echoed in what we saw on the show in Jon killing Dany. And I would, if you want my long form answer on this, I would suggest you have a look for a video I did, I don't know, 2 years ago perhaps, that was called something like "Will Jon Kill Daenerys?" Now, this was quite a long, convoluted argument based upon Dany's visions in the House of the Undying, the fact that she has to uh, uh, effectively light one more fire, and this seems to be connected with love and betrayal, and it made sense to me. There's a whole lot more logic in there as well. Dany does not actually light many fires herself. Normally, she gets her dragons to light the fires, but there are 2 fires that she has lit. The fire for Khal Drogo's funeral pyre, she lit that herself personally. There will be the fire we saw on the show. I'm sure we'll see it in the books. The fire that destroys the Khals and gets the Khalasar on her side. The 3rd fire makes thematic sense if this is a fire that she herself lights to light a sword in some way. Now, that was all speculation. It seems to be backed up with what was going on with on the show. But Jon's fiery sword, I think, is possibly literal as well as figurative. It has to be said. As for Brandon, I think that his bloody sword is just trying to show us that swords can be figurative as well as literal. I think that that's where he was at. That we should see there being echoes in Rhaegar and Liana taking the Azor Ahai Nisa roles as well. George R. R. Martin doesn't just work in one thing, meaning one thing. He works on many, many different layers, and many different characters and sets of characters have the same echoes that work through their characters. So yes, you would get, and in that, figuratively, Rhaegar thrust his sword into Liana, and what emerged from that was Jon Snow, who is figuratively Lightbringer and will save humanity. So that's where that one comes from. Many different iterations of that kind of model, and I think Jon and Dany will be another one of that. So I hope that kind of answers that question. But thank you. A Greek weirwood saying, how many brain cannons will go off if Jon isn't really named Aegon, but something else? Yeah, so I think that's a good question. So I think for me, the important point actually is not so much the fact that that Jon was named Aegon. It makes sense to me. Again, I did a video on that, why he would be named Aegon. It does make sense to me. But the important point is the fact that Liana on the show, and I think in the books, named her child a Targaryen name. That is not what you do if your thought is, actually, I want this child to be completely incognito and no one will ever know that they're Targaryen. She told Ned what his name was and wanted Ned to tell that child that he was Aegon Targaryen. And I don't think it makes any difference whether he was named Jaehaerys Targaryen or any other kind of Targaryen-y name. The fact is that it is a Targaryen name that Liana gave him, and that means that she wanted him to know who he was. She didn't say, his name is John, pretends that he's your son. She said his name is Aegon. That clearly says that she wanted him to know who he was when he grew up. Melissa Schultz says John's real name is Leslie Targaryen. It's an option. Donna Daly, thank you so much for the super chat. Probably a silly question, but was reading the books recently and noticed many scenes where there just happened to be crows or ravens there. Bloodraven, yeah. If in doubt, blame Bloodraven. I don't think it's a silly question. I think that's the obvious example is Joe Mormont's Raven, which is there, and he's so that is very clearly in my mind that is Bloodraven seeing what's going on at the wall, and you see it there suspiciously looking at bits of paper and apparently reading them, and you just go, that's not a normal bird, is it? There's something else going on there. And he says all these kind of like king and all the rest of it. I think that in the pre-release chapters of the Winds of Winter, you will also find the Theon chapter has a lot of that going on. So I think that yes, it's not reading too much into it. Bloodraven has been pulling the strings all the way through it in the north, in particular, and he is deliberately spying on what's going on. He has 1,000 eyes on one. He's looking to see what's going on. Black Emperor saying, did you hear about George saying that he thinks he may have bit off more than he can chew, going from 9 to 35 POV characters, basically juggling 2 balls compared to 8? Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether he thinks he's bitten off more than he can chew, but I think it is very clear that he has got a hugely complicated story that I can't conceptualize how he can finish it in 2 books. They would have to be 2 mammoth books. As I say, if you literally just try and think how many POV chapters you would have to take for John's story to end, or Dany's story to end, or Arya's story to end, it's a huge amount. We will see characters die. Obviously, I think we're at the maximum now, and it's now going to start coming back down in again. But yeah, he's it's a lot. It's a lot he's got going on. Shauna Bass, thank you so much for the super chat. Saying the show made Dany and Jon into fairly black and white people in the end, her being pure evil and him being good. Do you think Martin will build more shades of grey into them in the books? Yeah, absolutely. I think that Jon is necessarily, I mean, he's not that kind of pure character in the books already. And I think that as he sort of descends, as he dies and comes back, I think that we will find that he will lose a bit of himself there, and he will become a darker character. I think that they didn't want that to happen on the show, so I think that he will be a darker character. I think he will still be doing what he thinks is right. I think that he will still end up in the same rough sort of way, heading north in this kind of Frodo way that I was watching the Lord of the Rings films actually just the other day. Great way to spend a day, fantastic way to spend a day, and it is very obvious watching them again. Frodo is not just a cut and dried good guy. He's downright horrible at times, and the ring affects him hugely. And this is where Jon's character is going to be going. I think he will lose part of his humanity as he goes through this story. As for Dany, I think the show tried to not initially paint her as being this cut and dried evil person. Yes, in the last episode or so she was, but they tried to show her, pardon me, at King's Landing, what she did there, for example, as being more just a complete outpouring of emotion and grief and anger and everything at the same time, rather than it being a purely evil act. It was only later, when they were clearly mimicking this kind of like fascist approach to rallying the troops, that they tried to make her look purely evil. I think what we will see with Dany in the books is this slow build-up of actions that become increasingly questionable in terms of their justification. And what I mean by that is that what happened on the show in King's Landing seemed to many people to come almost out of the blue. Where did that come from? Burning an entire city down? That's just completely out of character. I think what we will see on the show, in the books, they tried it a bit on the show, but they didn't really tease it out well. But in the books, I think that we'll just see this this graduation of her doing things that you start off sympathizing with completely, and then end up with you questioning almost completely. For example, she will burn the Carls. They kidnapped her. They want to imprison her forever. There's basically not much to like about them, and so her burning them to a crisp, it feels quite justifiable. Yeah, we might, the modern morals, we might not say that that's the best way of doing things, but we would go, okay, we understand why she would do that. Then she will probably get to a point where she's burning down, to a greater or lesser extent, one of the slaver cities, and we'll go, okay, well, I kind of understand it, because clearly this is a slaver city, but there were probably some innocent people there as well. Is that a fair amount of innocent casualties? And then I think we'll move on and on to each time questioning a little bit more, until we get to King's Landing and thinking, actually, this is not justifiable. So I think that we will see her shift more and more. I think we saw the start of it at the very end of A Dance with Dragons. Quaithe is egging her on to be remembering who she is, fire and blood and all the rest of it. So that is where I think she's going to be going. She will be black and white. She's not going to end up as just being this completely horrible person. She will want to rule in order to make the world a better place. She will join the fight against the others, I'm sure of it. So she's not going to be just evil, but she will have more layers going on, and the layers will be built up over time. Melissa Schultz, good point. Dany wouldn't be on such a downward spiral if she didn't have so many yes men. She needs somebody to be frank with her. Barristan needs to step up and tell her some harsh truths. Yeah, so I think I hope this is where Tyrion comes in. Again, they showed it a bit on the show, but it got quite repetitive of her saying, I'm going to burn a city, and him saying, oh, please don't. I think that he is going to be the person who we could, to a degree, is going to feel that he can tell her the hard truths. And this is something I don't think we pick up on huge amounts, but Tyrion, they've showed in his recent story over in Essos how he is there as sort of this court jester. A lot of people of his stature are treated as these kind of comic figures, and traditionally that kind of court jester character was the kind of person who could speak truth to power, because people just thought that they were joking. So I think that is one of the echoes that George R. R. Martin is wanting us to think about with him, as being this character who can speak truth to power because of who he is. Okay, let's go to... so Morley asks, a prequel that included the backstory of Bloodraven would be an interesting one to watch. What stories and characters would you like to see included? Duncan Egg, other characters? Yeah, I would love to see a a spin-off with Bloodraven. We're not going to see one, unfortunately. George R. R. Martin has been very clear. None of the spin-offs are going to feature characters that are in Game of Thrones, the TV show. So we're not going to have any of those same characters. I would love to see Duncan Egg, the TV show. That's not going to happen until at the earliest he writes all of the stories, and that's a long way away. He's already muttering about maybe doing 12 of them. I mean, the only good news on that front, I think, is that he's given out now his priorities for the next 4 or 5 books he's going to be writing, and the thing he's going to write immediately after he finishes The Winds of Winter is the next Duncan Egg story. So hopefully that will come quite soon. But no, I don't think we're going to see that anytime soon. I don't think we're going to see Bloodraven anytime soon, which is a shame because I think it'd be a fantastic story. Okay, guys, we've got about 10 more minutes, I think. So we're going to. I've got 1 or 2 more questions from my patrons, but I'm going to start diving into questions in the chat. So now is the time to drop any more questions in if you'd like me to be covering them. Andrew Burnett, actually over on Facebook, I picked up the questions. I thought it was quite a fun one, saying, do you think we will have a next generation of the major houses in our story? Do we see the Lannisters or Starks having any more kids? Because I don't. I think that we will see. Well, first of all, in the books, particularly the Lannisters, their houses are the families are much bigger than we see on the show. So in the show, we just think, oh well, when Cersei, Jaime, and Tyrion die, that's it. But in the books, we get cousins all over the place. Pardon me. So I think that the house can continue, and this is quite an important point, is that if you get any house could continue, they don't just die out when one branch of that family dies out, just another branch of the family would take over. If you take, for example, the British royal family, they know who were the first 100, 200, however many people in line. So even if a whole branch of it died out, there's always somebody next in line. There is, with the Lannisters, always somebody next in line. With the Starks, it's perhaps slightly different because you'd have to go back at least a couple of generations there, because if, as I suspect will be the case, where we get Arya's not going to be hanging around, Bran will, working assumption, end up in the same place in the books as you did on the show. I think Recomm will die. I think Jon will head off north. I think that this will leave just Sansa, and so it's just down to whether or not Sansa, I mean, she could rule as this kind of Virgin Queen Elizabeth I figure from the north, which is entirely possible. There is certainly that kind of imagery to her, but also it's entirely possible that she might marry and then her children would rule on. Maybe they would keep the name Stark. But if that generation doesn't have children, the generation above didn't, because Brandon obviously died. Liana just had the one child before she died, and Benjen didn't have any children. So you then have to go another generation up, and that's the point at which it's starting to get a little bit uncertain, because they're people who are a long way away from the sort of line of succession. So, but at a high level, I think that the world will change. I don't think we're going to see a huge amount of what's happening going forward in the books, but the world will change. House Lannister, as we know it, will largely die out, other than I suspect Tyrion will survive. House Stark will largely die out, other than I suspect Sansa will carry on ruling from the north. And we've seen other families as well that have been decimated, if not destroyed. So we get the Baratheons. I think that what we see in the Arryns as well, and the Tyrells. There are a lot of Tyrells hanging around, but a lot of them will be gone. So we're going to see a complete overhaul. So yes, I think is the short answer. We will see a new set of houses ruling around the place. Donald Peoples, thank you so much for the super chat, saying, I truly appreciate you and your content. Always a pleasure, Robert. Thank you. I really appreciate that. Morgan R.R. Hayes, thank you, saying, Arya was only one to give a wolf a normal human name. That's an interesting observation. Yeah, so we've got Grey Wind, Ghost, Shaggy Dog, Summer, and Lady, and the only one that had a normal human name was Nymeria. I don't think that necessarily implies anything. The wolf naming seems to be a hint about the fate of the person who owns that wolf. So Nymeria seems to be Nymeria was a warrior queen, and this seems to be hinting that Arya is going to be a warrior, added to which Nymeria came from Essos across to Westeros, and that's again what Arya is going to be doing. So that seems to be the hint there. It does sort of tie in with what the show ending was of her sort of heading off west in a boat, because that's what Nymeria did from their homeland in Essos, headed off west in a boat to go to Westeros. But then the other, I won't reiterate the point because I've said it many times over, but the other direwolves' names reflect the fate of their owner. I think that the only thing that we've changed our thoughts on, particularly here recently, was Bran, where Summer always felt a little bit odd, but it now makes huge amounts of sense if he is going to be the king of summer. Bran is not there. His role is not to bring about spring. He's not there to bring about the end of the others so much as to rule over summer after all of this has ended and things are moving on. So that's the link there. Black Emperor says, Battle Isle seems to be a likely candidate for the last battle to happen. Maybe it was where the last battle happened previously. Everyone was fought back to as far south as south goes. So Battle Isle, for those who don't know, is the island in Old Town where the Hightower is now based, and nobody remembers why it's called Battle Isle. It's just there obviously was a battle there at some point. I think that that's possible. My take, though, is that the Isle of Gods, the Isle of Faces in the God's Eye Lake is the most likely candidate for where it's going to be, because George R. R. Martin has clearly been hinting that we will return there. We're going to discover more about it, and because it is sort of thematically in the center of everything that's been going on. So that's that's where we're at. I think with that, I'll do a couple of random questions from the chat just before ending off. Brenda Starr says, do you think that Quaith's purpose is to take Dany to the dark side? No, I don't. I think Quaith's purpose is to make Dany go to Westeros and be Targaryen, where what was going on in Meereen was that she was trying to be a good ruler in Meereen, making compromises, trying to make the difficult decisions that rulers have to make. And it was taking her away from what her fate is, if you think about it in that way, to be going over and to be aiding in the battle. If there are people who think that she is, Marwyn the Mage is one, Aemon Targaryen, Maester Aemon is another, who think that she is the prince that was promised. So her role, for those people, her role is to be going over to Westeros and helping lead the fight against the others. So I think there's a good chance Quaith might be doing that. There's also a good chance that she might be as a part of this, wanting her to be Targaryen and to help reclaim the Targaryen throne. So that's what it is, not to make her bad or dark or anything like that, but be Targaryen. And that can appear bad and dark to people who are, being firebombed by a dragon, but it's not about making her black or dark. So Robert Stevens asks, will the Hightowers be big players in the final books? Yeah, I think they have to be. The Hightowers are one of the biggest and most important houses in Westeros. They've been very quiet so far. And there are a whole lot of just slightly mysterious things. So they're, the Leighton Hightowers up there at the top of the high tower, just doing secret stuff that you don't just have that in a story if that doesn't turn into something. There's obviously going to be a big battle off the coast of Old Town. Euron, every hint that Euron's going to go in and try and raise Old Town, burn the library, and so on. The Hightowers will definitely have a role to play. There is a possibility that they may align themselves with Aegon's attempt to take control. And I say it's a possibility, it's a throwaway line, but it has to mean something. Illyrio talks sort of mysteriously about we have friends in the Reach. Now, that seems to imply that they've got some allies in the Reach. Could it be the Tyrells? Well, probably not. But the Tyrells are actually, although they're the titular heads of the Reach, Lord Paramount of the Reach, the Hightowers are the strongest family there. So it's entirely possible that they are the mysterious friends in the Reach. They have got a history of getting themselves involved in politics in Westeros, so it will be a surprise if they haven't got some cunning plan going on. Just sort of sitting there not doing anything isn't really their style. So that's where we're at. Okay, I think that I am going to end it there. My voice is starting to get a little bit croaky. So, guys, thank you so much. I'll be back this time next week. I will definitely, I think, next week again be doing this same start time, 5 o'clock Eastern. It's 10 o'clock my time. It works a lot better for me. Just judging from the number of people who were here watching this, it seems to work well for other people as well. So I think we'll stick to this new time from now on Thursdays. I hope that works for you. Apologies if it doesn't. But thank you so much. Some fantastic questions this time. I've got a whole load of really exciting guests lined up for the next few weeks on here, talking through a huge range of different subjects. So thank you so much. If you are watching this later and are interested in any other live streams I've been doing, then appearing somewhere up here, there will be a link to other live streams I've been doing. If you are at all interested in becoming a patron, supporting this channel, getting access to some stuff I do uniquely for my patrons, then there will be a link appearing somewhere up here at the end of this video. Okay, guys, thank you so much. I've had a really good time with this one. Thank you, and I will see you again next time. Take care.